Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, as it may be, to those of you on the West Coast. My name is Carl Fippinger. I'm Vice President of Fire and Disaster Mitigation at the International Code Council, and I work in our Government Relations Department. I'd like to welcome you to the Future of Building Codes and Hazard Mitigation as we celebrate the final week of Building Safety Month. Week 4 is Disaster Preparedness, and we'd like to thank our sponsors, Simpson Strong Tie, for sponsoring the week. That's www.strongtie.com, and our session sponsor, Four Leaf Incorporated. They can be found on the web at www.4leaf Inc. or fourleafinc.com. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel. Thank you for joining us today. First, Cindy Davis, our ICC Vice President. Cindy's also the Deputy Director of Building and Fire Regulations at the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development in Richmond, Virginia. Eric Letvin joins us from FEMA. He's Deputy Assistant Administrator for Mitigation at the Federal Emergency Management Agency in Washington, D.C. And Edward Latch, Director of Planning, Safety, and Building Science Division at FEMA in Washington, D.C. as well. And then finally, former FEMA Deputy Administrator and now Managing Director Public Sector at Marsh McLennan, Daniel Kanuski. Welcome to all of you and thanks for joining us. With that, what I'd like to do is I'm going to share some content here. We're going to first show a video from our sponsor, Four Leaf, and it'll be a great opportunity for us to kind of get focused on what is happening in the wide world of disaster recovery, and then shift that into disaster mitigation and what's happening currently with the codes and the future of mitigation. So sit back and enjoy this 4-minute video from our friends at Four Leaf. So thank you once again to our partners at Four Leaf. They're the session sponsor of today's session. You can again visit them www.4leaf, L-E-A-F, Inc.com. And with that, I think it's a great reminder that there is a lot going on, particularly in the wide world of disaster recovery. But we're going to shift focus a little bit here and move into the aspects of disaster preparedness and mitigation efforts and talk a little bit about that today. And I think it's a pretty strong tie into what we just saw, in that you see the recovery happening in places like Paradise, and it just reemphasizes how much we are focusing on prevention, rebuilding stronger, and making sure, in particular in places like Paradise that have experienced the effects of wildfire, that they're rebuilding stronger and hardening homes against the effects of wildfire. So we'll talk a little bit about that more here in a few minutes. But at this point, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Eric Letvin. Again, Eric is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Mitigation at the Federal Emergency Management Agency here in Washington, D.C. Eric is going to give us a few minutes of presentation on FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. It is now overnight, it went from being a $500 million to a $1 billion program with the administration's announcement yesterday. Many of you saw on TV, President Biden attended a senior executive briefing at FEMA that was attended by DHS Secretary Mayorkas and FEMA Administrator as well. So the entire team had the opportunity to brief the president yesterday, and at the same time they unveiled essentially double the money for FEMA's BRIC program. So with that being said, I'd like to hand the microphone over to Eric and allow him to maybe expand on the details of that and talk to you about the exciting news, as well as some of the details surrounding BRIC currently and into fiscal year 2021. So Eric, the stage is yours.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it was certainly a very exciting day yesterday, and even the slides that I'm going to share with you shortly, I'll have to talk and even update them in terms of what was announced yesterday. Carl, are you going to post the slides?
Yep, they're coming up right now, and the slides are also posted for all of our registrants as you come in, and as you exit today, you'll see them posted as part of this presentation today, so you'll be able to actually download those materials in PDF and keep those as well. So.
All right, well, I'm going to talk for just about 10 minutes, and I'm going to move fairly quickly. I know a lot of you are familiar with the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities grant program, and I had the pleasure of working to help build this new pre-disaster mitigation grant program with Dr. Kanuski when he was Associate Administrator at FEMA. So he certainly had a lot to do with helping get this program off the ground. I want to thank him for his leadership there. Next slide. Just want to talk about, so this was the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grant Program, and we refer to it as BRIC. It was part of the 2018 Disaster Recovery Reform Act, Section 1234, which essentially created this brand new grant program. Right after the legislation passed, we went out with a public engagement session and really asked all of you, and we received comments from ICC and many others, what should this program be? We have the wonderful opportunity, generational opportunity, to create a brand new pre-disaster hazard mitigation program, and what should it look like? And we came up with these guiding principles here: supporting community capacity building, encouraging innovation, promoting partnerships, enable large infrastructure projects. Really look to, like, how do we take entire neighborhoods out of the floodplain? How do we really fund projects that are maybe larger than we funded before, but are more impactful? Maintain flexibility, provide consistency, and then supporting our strategic plan of building a culture of preparedness, readying the nation for catastrophic disasters, and very importantly, reducing the complexity of FEMA. Next slide, please. So our priorities for year one, as I mentioned, was encouraging some of these larger infrastructure projects, but also residential projects as well. Everything that was eligible in the past is still eligible, and in fact, it was expanded by the legislation. Increasing projects that mitigate one or more lifelines. And a lifeline is things like power or water, or communications or healthcare. A lot of this came from what we learned in Puerto Rico, that if one lifeline goes down, pretty much everything goes down. So how do we not just put focus on the protecting the building envelope on a hospital, but how do we maintain medical gases and power and communications with that hospital? Think more broadly. Incorporating nature-based solutions was very popular among our stakeholders, and obviously incentivizing the adoption and enforcement of modern building codes, and that is legislation. Next slide, please. So where are we right now? We last year in August, we announced that there was $500 million of funds available. That grant application period closed in January. We received between BRIC and our flood mitigation assistance program, roughly $3.7 billion. We were like 7 times oversubscribed Fed share of funds that we had available. So our team is currently going through all of those projects, and we'll be making announcements probably in July. We are now currently working with the White House on releasing the new funding notice of funding opportunity. What was announced yesterday was the actual amount. That is $1 billion. We still need to publish the official notice of funding opportunity, and there will be some changes from year 2, from year 1. Probably not major changes, but there will be changes. We'll open the application period up in the fall. It'll close again at the end of January, and we'll go through the same cycle over and over again. Next slide, please. So yeah, we said announce later in the summer, probably July, make limited changes to the NOFO. I don't know exactly when that's going to be published. No later than August, hopefully before August, to try to give you as much. There was a lot of stress last year. Some of the states had pre-application submittal periods before we did, and the net effect of that was a lot of communities simply didn't have a lot of time to submit applications. So what we want to do is get our notice of funding opportunity, our criteria out there as quickly as possible, even before the grant application opens up, so that there's transparency and predictability, and people have, frankly, more time. So we're working very hard to release that as quickly as possible. So this bullet, when I submitted the slide deck last Friday, certainly changed. The amount of funding was determined to be $1 billion. That was announced yesterday by the president. There's information on whitehouse.gov. There's a fact sheet that talks about BRIC and all the other things that were announced and released yesterday. So I encourage you to go to whitehouse.gov and take a look at that. And once we do post the notice of funding opportunity, we will do the same thing we did last summer, which I think worked very well. We had a number of webinars. We had like one on nature-based solutions. We had one on planning. We had one on building codes. We'll do something very similar this summer in terms of the date and what the content of all those webinars will be. They were very widely attended. That is to come. So look for that as well this summer. Next slide. So how does the funding actually work? So by law, over half of the dollars need to go towards projects. That's the national competition for mitigation projects. That's where the vast majority of the funds went for BRIC year 1. There was a tribal set aside, and there was also a state and territory allocation of $600,000 available for the states or territories and whatever tribe that wanted to submit an application for that. Next slide. So I get this question quite a bit. Who is eligible for BRIC funding? So technically the applicant is the state, federally recognized tribe, or territory. So they're the ones that are actually hitting send on the applications into FEMA. Sub-applicants are local governments. They can be tribes. They can also be state agencies or tribal agencies. So typically that is the local community. So an NGO or non-governmental organization or a private citizen cannot apply to BRIC funding. They would have to be sponsored by their local government. And That is determined by the local government. It's often a state or a local emergency management agency. It could be the Department of Public Works, whatever that local entity is that would then work with the state designated agency, which is typically a state emergency management agency or Department of Homeland Security, that would hit the send button to us. So that's how that whole process works. And that's the way it's been for a long time with our grant programs. But with $1 billion now, there's a whole lot of interest, and we're getting questions from people, frankly, we've never interacted with before. So this question is coming up quite a bit lately. Next slide. So eligible activities, and I'll talk here about everything, as I mentioned, that was eligible before is still eligible. We have a hazard mitigation assistance guide, which is available for download. We're currently updating that, but everything that's been eligible is still eligible. So we expanded the eligibility to include project scoping. That is, if you think you have a project, but you need a little bit of money to potentially hire an engineer and do some modeling or what have you, or do some cost estimating, or do some preliminary environmental compliance, you can apply for money for that, just doing the project scoping. Building code activities, I'll talk about that on a subsequent slide, but building code activities are also eligible by law for BRIC. And there's additional activities for wildfire and wind and earthquake early warning. Again, outside of the state set aside, the projects must be cost effective, they must reduce or eliminate damage from a future natural hazard, and it has to meet the latest 2 consensus codes, and it needs to comply with the state and local hazard mitigation plan, and of course, any of the environmental and historic preservation requirements. And these have been the same kinds of things that we've had for years. Next slide. So talk about BRIC and building codes a little bit. Building code activities funding under the capacity and capability building $600,000 set aside. So that can be adoption, enforcement, upgrading your current code. Those are all eligible activities as part of that. We also, as part of it's a competition for the projects. On the project side, we very strongly aligned our point-based system with the adoption and enforcement of building codes at both the state and the local level. So building codes are going to play very strongly when we make our awards in July. States that have adopted and enforced the latest 2 versions of the code are going to be much more competitive than states and local governments that have not. Next slide. And again, example of some of those activities: evaluate the adoption and implementation of codes that reduce risk, enhance an existing code, develop professional workforce capabilities through technical assistance and training are all eligible activities. When we make our awards in July, we will be providing much more information about what came in and what was ultimately selected. So we hope to include all that information and put it up on our website so you can see who was successful in receiving these type of awards. Next slide. And finally, just an example project, and this was one that was funded under our old pre-disaster mitigation program, which I think is a really nice example. $3.7 million went to Salt Lake City for a residential retrofit project called Fix the Bricks, which is aimed at retrofitting unreinforced masonry. There's a tremendous vulnerabilities with older residential structures in the Wasatch Valley. So they've been a very common applicant over the years, and we're very happy to fund projects like this in the future, and look forward to funding more great projects. And we'll certainly share those with you in July, and try to lift up some of those projects to be inspirational to other communities to submit similar projects later this year when we open up the $1 billion application period. So I will end with that and turn it back over to the moderator.
Great, Eric. Thanks so much. Appreciate that. And I'm sure folks will have plenty of questions. As a reminder to the audience, if you look in the bottom right side of your screen, you will see Q&A. We will, after Mr. Lash's presentation here, be entering into a moderated discussion where we'll be happy to take a look at the audience and do our best to answer those. My colleague Jacob Carson from ICC Government Relations is also monitoring the chat. And if there are easy questions to answer, you'll see Jacob in there kind of answering those away as immediately as we can in the chat. And those that are for the panel and ones that we can work in, we'll take those on a first come, first serve and see what themes develop. So with that, again, thank you, Eric. Stick around with us. We're looking forward to chatting with you. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our next panelist. This is Mr. Edward Latch. He's Director, Planning, Safety, and Building Science Division, Federal Emergency Management Agency in Washington, D.C. And Ed, with that, I will go ahead and load up your slides here momentarily.
Thank you, Carl.
There we go.
So, Carl, can you hear me fine?
I can, sir. Thanks.
Echo on my end. I don't know if that's something you guys can hear or not.
Yeah, and the way that you can adjust that, Ed, is if you're able to just turn your speaker down just a little bit, you'll not have that feedback.
Okay, can you repeat what you just said?
If you turn the volume on your computer down just slightly.
Yeah, unfortunately, I did that, and it's still happening. So give me just a second. All right. Can you hear me still now at this point?
Yes, sir.
And there's still an echo, correct? All right. I was fine until 2 minutes ago. I apologize. Now I have to figure out how to fix that. All right. I'm open to any suggestions you have, Carl, for why I've got my computer speakers turned off and my phone is on, which is what was working a minute ago, but now they're both playing no matter what.
Yeah, I think we're getting good audio from your computer, and if you were to mute your phone, I think that would solve it for us.
All right. All right, let's try this one more time. If you can hear me now. All right, sorry about that, gentlemen and ladies. I would like to talk for just a few minutes about some work FEMA has been doing in this area and tie that together with an internal effort we've got going on now to develop an agency-wide strategy. But I wanted to preface it by tying and connecting this work we're undertaking now to a couple of recent studies, one by NIBS and another that we did. And with that, if you could move to the next slide. So where are we as an agency in terms of our building codes work? Disaster-resistant building codes, as we know, they reduce the impact of climate change, help address critical needs of vulnerable communities. And why would I start with that statement? It's because as I think we can all understand that to the extent that climate impact increases the severity and frequency of disasters in this country, we can all see and readily understand that strong disaster-resistant building codes that are enforced at the local level have a habit of producing stronger, more resilient buildings. And those buildings, therefore, and by definition, will resist and stand up better against the effects of disasters, both natural and other, and those that are, even those that are increasing as a result of increasing climate change. So FEMA is developing an agency strategy to advance disaster-resistant codes at the state and local level. And we're using that as a starting point to engage with other federal agencies and ultimately to engage nationally around an implementation plan for how we can advance and enhance disaster-resistant codes across the country. Next slide, please. As you all may well be aware, some years ago, back in the early 2000s, NIBS undertook a study called Mitigation Savings, and it showed, amongst other things, significant savings from investments in building codes and in federal investments in mitigation. That study was revisited in recent years with by NIBS with support from a variety of groups, including yours and ours as well. And as was well advertised and well reported, there were even further and more dramatic and more significant savings identified by that study and that work. Savings of up to $11 for every dollar invested, either in federal mitigation, and significant savings as well for investments in building codes. I know it's been talked about a lot, but it's worth noting that this is an important data point. This is an important element that underpins the question of why would you have strong mitigation and why would you have disaster resistant codes. That was said earlier. They save money and they save lives and they save people's property and their things. Next slide. In addition, we some years ago became enamored with and committed to the idea of trying to identify what the savings are that occur from the adoption of disaster-resistant codes. Some years back, that question had been asked, but there was really I don't think, no effective way to manage the sheer volume and the size of the task. How would you gather information about all those jurisdictions? How would you grind the numbers? How would you identify what the hazards and the risks are? How would you aggregate that literally across millions and millions of properties in the United States? But as time went by and as data tools and data equipment became better, the HAZAS model came online, important and large-scale tracking systems were available through private organizations like CoreLogic and others. The work that was done by ISO and their building code and effectiveness grading system all sort of converged. And some years ago, we realized it was probably time to attempt to do a nationwide study on the avoided losses from disaster-resistant building codes. And we did that using the advent of the modern international codes in the year 2000 as a starting point. So what we did was we looked through this 100-odd million database set that CoreLogic has. We identified for the areas of greatest interest for earthquake, wind, and flood, about 18 million of those post-2000 properties. We looked at flood, hurricane winds, and seismic. We ran the before and after numbers. We did a massive analysis. And what it showed is that over the last 20 years, we have identified savings of about $32 billion. About $1.6 billion a year is what we're very conservatively estimating right now, knowing that what we measured was the tip of all that goes on out there, and what we were able to quantify is a small percentage of the total number of things and the total number of areas of savings that we know exist. Next slide. And so if we look at what we have learned so far and we project that number going forward, first we see for the study, we see considerable savings being documented in the hurricane wind and the flood areas, not so much an earthquake. And that isn't a reflection of one hazard being more or less important than the other. It's a reflection of where certain parts of the country that are subject to these hazards, where their typical and their average construction is, I don't know, how closely and how well they do at enforcing all the provisions of their codes. And the history of seismic-related provisions in the Western United States dates back a good bit farther than some of these other areas, and their history is such that the construction that we were seeing there was a bit closer to what we're seeing in the I codes than you might see in some flood-prone areas or in some hurricane-prone areas. And so what you see looks to be a somewhat skewed set of numbers, but it's simply a reflection of what over the last 20 years, based on how the areas of high risk were carrying out their code activities versus what the international codes are calling for. Next slide. And so if you look forward, if nothing else changes, if we stay on the projection that we are on now, what you start to see and what we should expect to see is a significant and growing level of avoided losses. We should expect to see the amount of savings continue like compounding interest to grow and grow. By the time we get to 2040, some 20 years out from now, we can reasonably expect to be seeing a savings in the neighborhood of an aggregate of $132 billion. And you can go out further to 2060 and you can bend that curve as a result of code enforcement, and as a result of good code adoption and good of other things that will drive improvements in the code enforcement that will bend that number up even further. Next slide. And so I give you that as a preview, and just mention again that the Insurance Services Organization, the group that manages and runs the building code enforcement effectiveness grading system, does produce annual reports and information either by region or by states that have a ton of really important and valuable information in them about code adoptions at the state level and about where those code adoptions are trending over time. Next slide. And so for us at FEMA and within our Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration, we have long seen the work we do as represented in this chart. That we're in the business of working with others who conduct basic research or going into the field following disasters to take lessons learned and translate all of that into tools and guidance and best practices that amongst a large group of partners and others often will find their way forward to your organizations in the form of proposed building code changes. And we are active participants and partner with many folks and participate in the building codes and standards process, including a number of provisions we put forward during the last cycle and in the cycle we're in the middle of. And so we actively participate and try to translate our knowledge there so that ultimately strong building code provisions coupled with effective outreach and implementation ultimately to reduce disaster losses. And we see this as a cycle. We are doing things at every one of these places around this circle, and we're constantly trying to advance various projects, various ideas, various hazard mitigation techniques. Next slide. And so a few slides here as we close, just to update you and keep you up to speed on the work that's going on now within the agency around building codes. And we are attempting to build a resilient nation with superior building performance in disasters. And to do so, we're going to coordinate and prioritize our activities to advance the adoption and enforcement of codes for both FEMA programs and for communities nationwide. Next slide. And how are we going to do that? As I said, we are in the process of creating an agency strategy and implementation plan. We have begun interacting with and communicating with our federal partners, conducting like a landscape survey to get a pulse on where the rest of the federal family is on codes, where they are now, what their gaps and strengths are, where they are ready to coordinate or work together, and what their needs and gaps might be. Ultimately, all of this, we believe and hope, will be translating into implementation plans and implementation actions that clearly, based on the way codes work and based on how codes are adopted and enforced, needs to be a partnership effort. And we're hoping to bring what we're learning and what we're pulling together at the FEMA and federal level to this national conversation. Next slide. And so for us and for our strategy, it boils down to several goals and a handful of objectives. We need to integrate building codes and standards across our agency. We need to strengthen the nationwide capability for superior codes and superior building performance. And ultimately, and this is where the rubber meets the road, we need to work with others to drive public action on building codes. You can use any term you want, but it's really advocating for influencing and driving public action. We're aware, if you glance through the objectives, that climate plays an important part of this. We're also aware that equities and vulnerable communities and at-risk communities and underserved communities are all target areas and areas of focus as we seek to try to move the conversation on strong building codes along, and to do so with data, to do so with excellent storytelling, to do so with partnerships, and to do so with a coordinated and efficient effort to take our resources and what we're putting towards this and leverage it nationally. Next slide. And so the last, just to wrap up, FEMA is trying to put its money where its mouth is. We are investing significant amounts of money in developing the strategy. We've worked with all the major components across all the regional offices. We have sought and received support from OMB and the president on some funding for additional positions in our regional offices to help develop a cadre there. And next slide. And so our agency strategy through our building codes working group, we are working to take the goals and objectives, translate that into an implementation plan and a series of targeted actions, whether that's sharing training information, whether that's developing effective externally facing communications tools, partnering and leveraging with partners at the SLTT, nonprofit, university and public sector, officials and regulators and decision makers, pretty much everybody. We want to increase the adoption and enforcement of building codes, right? It's a cost-effective way of doing that. If we're saving $11 for every dollar invested, we think that we can really generate momentum and really move this ball forward. So this strategy will serve as a foundation, and our success requires coordination with you, with industry partners, with states and locals, and with everybody who has an interest and a stake in building codes. And I think the next slide may be the last one. And so with that, apologize for the audio trouble at first. I can be a little challenged that way, and thank you for your time.
Ed, thank you so much for that presentation. And at this point, what I'd like to do is to ask all of our panelists to turn on their cameras, maybe come off mute, or at least practice active mute discipline. I'll coin that phrase for today. With that, what I'd like to do is invite Ed and Eric to stick around, but also maybe kind of re-engage a little bit with our ICC Vice President, Cindy Davis, and also Dr. Dan Kanuski, who used to be Deputy Administrator at FEMA and now managing public sector work for Marsh McLennan. So with that, what I'd like to do is maybe just kind of kick into a quick question for the group to get us started. And I see that we have a few in the Q&A. I'll also encourage our audience to go ahead and submit your questions now at the bottom right in the Q&A frame. And we'll do our best to get through as many of those as we possibly can. But maybe one just to kind of get us started. So what is your advice to code officials on maybe how best to engage with their emergency management partners kind of in this new world that we're living in? I mean, BRIC and some of the programs that Mr. Lash talked about are doing a lot to be able to drive the building codes and mitigation and emergency management and code officials together. So with that, we've got kind of this new stakeholder group that's a bit of a non-traditional group that is coming into more of the traditional emergency management folds. And I guess I would want to hear from the group, Cindy, Dan, others, what would be your advice to the code officials, including building code officials and our fire officials listening today, how they can take a proactive stance to kind of become part of that culture now within emergency management and be a vital stakeholder? Cindy?
Thank you, Carl. Before I jump to the question, I'd just like to take a moment to thank our panelists on behalf of the International Code Council for spending time with us today and talking about this critically important subject. As Eric mentioned before, yesterday's announcement is apropos for this conversation. So how can code officials get more involved in making sure that building codes are part of the conversation? It's I think the code profession has long lamented that it's difficult to quantify what doesn't happen. But Ed's report and the NIBS report, the Mitigation Saves, seems to do exactly that. So I don't think that it's too much of a stretch to say that building codes are the vaccine for natural disasters. It doesn't prevent them, but it sure does lessen the need for response, recovery, temporary housing, all of the above. Ed Latch and the FEMA's Building Science branch are superheroes for the Code Council in spreading the word and presenting the science behind the importance of building codes. The payback to taxpayers is huge, as Ed pointed out. As FEMA describes, codes provide low cost, high impact. So we would welcome, on behalf of the Code Council, any opportunity to work more closely to help educate emergency managers on the mitigation benefits of the codes with organizations like the National Emergency Management Association, the International Association of Emergency Managers, and with our state hazard mitigation partners through the National Hazard Mitigation Association. From personal experience, I think there's been a long history of disconnect between code professionals and the folks at the emergency management level. So building that relationship is important. Outreach is important. Getting involved in your local emergency management planning, getting involved at the state level of emergency management planning, trying to obtain a seat at the table, maybe not on the advisory council level, but certainly on the work group level. And just continuing to reiterate the information that Ed just provided and the importance of building codes to prevent response and recovery efforts.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that. Dan, I'll turn to you and maybe get a quick reaction from you and then on to our FEMA counterparts. But how do we bring the code officials into the culture in emergency management? You've had a pretty long history of working through cultural change within the agency and in the private sector. So what are your thoughts?
Well, thanks, Carl. And first, let me just give kudos to Eric Lettvin and his team at FEMA. What a phenomenal accomplishment to have BRIC not only launched over this past year, but to have it immediately plussed up to a level that, frankly, I wouldn't have believed you if you would have told me this in 2017 when we started talking about the need for a new pre-disaster hazard mitigation program. $1.5 billion for the next year, that would have been a pipe dream. So kudos. They haven't even announced this year's awards, and they're already doubling that number. So that's really great to see. Now, as far as engaging code officials need to be part of the emergency management community. And so don't look at yourselves as a stakeholder on the outside. Think of yourselves as part of the community. And while I can't speak on behalf of FEMA any longer, I can speak on behalf of myself as a lifelong emergency manager and someone who cares deeply about this community, to say we want you to be part of this community. These were similar conversations I was having when I was at FEMA, and at the time I would use different examples. For cyber, we needed to engage the chief information security officers from every state and local government. For public health, we needed to engage those state and local public health officials to make sure we were prepared for health and medical emergencies. And look at how that's played out over the last year. For those communities that didn't have a strong relationship between the emergency manager and the public health officials, I think that you saw that it could have very well been a rocky start to that pandemic response, because you don't want to be meeting your colleagues on game day, right? The old adage, you don't want to be exchanging business cards on game day. You don't want to be doing the same either when it comes to whether it be applying for BRIC funding or to developing new code standards. You want to be there at the table with the emergency managers from the beginning. So please, we welcome you to our community in the same way that emergency managers across the country have welcomed public health officials to be part of the community over the past year. Welcome to our community now.
Excellent, thanks so much. And then finally, I'd either ask Eric or Ed to maybe take this on behalf of FEMA. I mean, from the federal level, you work, in support of your state and local tribal territorial partners. What would be your advice to the code official and the fire official community to kind of come on board, as Dan says? Who wants to take that?
I'll start, and Eric can certainly chime in. And I would amplify on what Dan said, which is and from my perspective and from my journey and history through the building codes process, which started in the private sector and then went through the National Association of Home Builders and then through State Farm Insurance and finally to FEMA, having sat on all those different seats and watched and tried to work with building code officials. There's a challenge. They're part of a team within their own jurisdictional organization. Includes, as everybody, like you said, from health officials to emergency managers to building code regulators to land use planners. And in each community, that plays out differently. And So one of the great challenges is finding ways to connect and finding ways to integrate your effort and your needs with the needs and interests of others. We see it happen fairly frequently in the flood space when land use planning and building regulation interface or interconnect on how to get houses elevated or in or out of the floodplain or in the right place. But I think there are, and we hope there will be, other opportunities. We plan to intensify and ramp up our outreach and education, training opportunities and things of that sort. We're going to try to keep building tools and keep pushing that message out. And hopefully as part of that message, maybe we can help create some opportunities to bring more folks to the table and bring more folks more information that makes them better armed to have these conversations internally. And Eric, I don't know if you've anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer the question a little bit of a different way. So I mentioned we're about 7 times oversubscribed on what was submitted for BRIC. And when we make our announcements in July, we're going to be letting a lot of state and local emergency management agencies know that their applications weren't selected, that we had $500 million and we chose the best $500 million worth of projects. Of the 200 points in the competitive criteria, 35 of them are around state and local building code adoption, whether they've adopted the latest 2 versions of the model code at the state level and their BSEG score at the local level. So I'm going to have a lot, I'll tell you right now, I'll share with you my talking points. I'm going to get a lot of calls from mayors and members of Congress, and they're going to ask why their project wasn't selected. And my top talking point is going to be, what is your building code in your state and your local jurisdiction? And to turn that negative into a positive, I'm going to say, look, building code adoption and enforcement and upgrading is an eligible BRIC activity. Please go forth and consider strengthening your state and local code and resubmitting that project next year. We have more money. We look forward to reviewing your application again, hopefully with a stronger building code to make your project more competitive.
Oh, good points. Thanks so much for that. And I think that that probably is a good opportunity to maybe pivot into something for Dan here really quick too. So Dan, I've been following you for a long time. We've known each other for a while, and I hear you talk a lot about the protection gap. That's a prime focus of what you're doing now on, you were doing it in the government, but you're doing it in the private sector now. And maybe you could offer up a little bit about the protection gap for the folks that are on and watching us today, and maybe a little bit about how that ties to mitigation and what you see as the future in that realm.
Sure. And as you've heard me say many times, I mean, we need to focus on resilience, right? And resilience needs to be more than just a buzzword. We have to make it tangible for Americans. We have to make it tangible for each of our industries. I look at resilience as 3 major elements: preparedness, hazard mitigation, and insurance. And you need all 3 of those. It's not an either or thing. You can't say, oh, I'm going to plus up preparedness, then we don't have to worry about this mitigation and insurance thing. No, not at all. And so the same way that I was passionate about insurance, for example, before, during, and after my time at FEMA, I want to practice what I preach. And so what I'm saying to the insurance industry, since that's where I now sit, is we need to be part of this solution in closing the protection gap. And the protection gap, quite simply, is the difference between what is insured in America and what the potential economic losses could be from disasters, right? And it's a huge gap, the gap between what's insured and what's not, essentially. And so clearly, insurance is one way to close that gap, making insurance more available, et cetera, right? But remember what I said, can't look at any of these in isolation. A great way to close that protection gap, a great way to make sure that individuals are protected financially from the effects of natural disasters is to lessen the effects at the beginning, right? To prevent as much as we can that damage from occurring, and thus the financial losses. And hazard mitigation fits that perfectly, of which I would consider strong building codes a huge part of what hazard mitigation is. So the more that this community, the code officials and strong building codes and you can make this a reality, the less Americans will be exposed to natural disasters, the less they will experience the financial losses from disasters, which we in the insurance industry will be there for those who are insured. We will be there for them. But far too many are uninsured. And would you believe that 2/3 of homeowners are underinsured? they just don't realize how much they could potentially lose, the contents of their homes and the structure. Again, strong building codes could prevent that loss and could prevent not only that homeowner from filing an insurance claim, but if 2/3 are underinsured, that'd be a financial loss that they themselves would have to bear.
Good points. And definitely something to think about. So let me follow up on that a little bit too, and then maybe look to Cindy for some reactions on this and back to the FEMA folks. So just last week, the administration issued an executive order on climate-related financial risk. So in that order, it calls for government-wide assessment and a strategy to mitigate climate-related financial risk. So kind of right in your wheelhouse there, right? The executive order stresses the need for public and private investments to play complementary roles in meeting needs. So I stress the public and the private partnership piece of that. What do you think are some examples of how this might look and feel when this kind of gets down on the ground to our code officials and other fire officials and is kind of working in practice?
Thank you, Carl. So the ability for public-private partnerships, I think, is key to this. And I'm going to use Virginia as an example of what I think is a success story in bringing the private players into the code adoption world and making sure that they are part of that process. Virginia, again, had a couple of years ago, Governor Northam issued an executive order focusing on resiliency, climate change, sea level rise, and that executive order required us to examine the upcoming code cycle and how it prepares Virginia for resiliency. So we put together a resiliency subwork group committee. I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to the FEMA folks at Region 3 and their involvement in that process. It allowed us to be able to bring together home builders, apartment building owners, everybody that had a stake in this process, bring forward some 2021 changes into the 2018 codes in Virginia, and work together to make sure that we analyze the current codes that will be effective in July 1st in Virginia, and how the resiliency would impact the state. So I think that is an example of bringing together public-private partnerships to increase resiliency overall.
Dan, thoughts on that before I turn to the folks at FEMA?
I agree. I mean, certainly what we're seeing with BRIC is a huge investment by the federal government, an infusion of funds from the federal government to help support hazard mitigation programs. But as I will frequently say, that's just a down payment. It's the federal government making a down payment in hazard mitigation, and it's up to the rest of us as individuals, as communities, as industry, in the private sector, to make those investments as well.
Very good. Eric, thoughts on that?
Yeah, it kind of goes full circle. So with that EO, it asked all the agencies to look at their programs and do an assessment of climate risk. And I'm sure we're looking at that at FEMA, but we want to talk about the disaster relief fund. That's the pot of money that we use to do all the things that we do, responding and recovering to disasters. So there was a study last week, an academic study that showed that $8 billion from Hurricane Sandy was related to climate change. So there's certainly climate risk with some of our disasters going forward, and there's a risk to the disaster relief fund, which is taxpayer dollars. So investments that we could make at the state and local level, adopting and enforcing modern building codes, actually, I think would help lower that risk to the disaster relief fund and the effects of climate change.
Yeah, so let me shift gears a little bit here too, in the time that we have left, because we're running a little short on time. An hour goes by so quickly. I've got a question from the audience. So and Eric, this one's for you. I'll let you kind of take it first and see if Ed wants to follow up on it. If a city or a county is a sub-applicant for BRIC and has the latest codes adopted, but the state does not have an updated code or even no code, how is that considered in the grant award consideration for BRIC?
Yeah, this question came up from our stakeholders when we were designing the program, and what we decided to do, of the 200 points, 20 of them have to do with the state or applicant, If they've adopted the 2015 or 2018, that's what's in year one of BRIC. And then we use 15 points has to do with the BSEG score of the local government, the sub-applicant rating 1 through 5. So you would receive points at the sub-applicant level, but you wouldn't receive points at the state level. So the emergency management community is going to be looking at where the dollars are going and looking at their codes and looking where they can pick up points. So I imagine there's going to be a lot of conversations.
Yeah, we look forward to helping you with the analysis on that too, and that data becomes available. That's certainly going to be a hot topic. Let me grab one more from the audience, and then I've got kind of a closing question for the whole panel. So it was, let's see here, it was mentioned that adopting one of the recent 2 code cycles is preferred during an application review. So let's give you the example that if the state is on, say, the IBC or the 2015 version of the IBC, the International Building Code, while the local community is actually on a more recent edition, the 2018 or the 2021. Does the state adoption affect or supersede the local applicant's position for, scenarios like home rule states?
I don't know that's a very good question. I don't know the specific answer to that one. The way it's set up again is the state level 2015 or 18 and the local level BSEG. So I would still think they would score very well, even if the local government has something stronger than the state. I assume their BSEG score would be pretty good, and they would collect, the majority of those 35 points.
Yeah, very good. Ed, any follow up on that? Now I've got a closing question for the group here. So we only got.
No, Eric's the guy on that. I'm not. Eric's got that covered.
Very good. All right. Well, let me give you one to chew on here, and we'll see how we can maybe take this in a bit of a lightning round. So, on the subject of incorporating building code strategies, let's talk a little bit for a second on how we, kind of all the folks here on the panel today, what can we do to more effectively partner with our state, local, territorial, and tribal partners to incentivize and maybe deepen the incorporation of building code strategies into our hazard mitigation plans. I know that's been something that we've talked about, Ed. Dan, I know we've had that conversation in your office previously. What can be done there? What do we think are the incentives around that to kind of get it done, since it's been something that maybe hasn't been taken up to the degree that we would hope that it would have been by now?
You want to start?
Sure. Well, you said incentives. The strongest incentive that we can show here is a return on investment. And as Ed mentioned, the 6-to-1 kind of return on investment, I'll put that in quotes, that you can get from investing in hazard mitigation. It's a great number. It's a very compelling number. And in full disclosure, I'm in a pro bono capacity affiliated with the National Institute of Building Sciences that came out with that number. But we can do one better. If you drill down on, if you look at the NIBS Mitigation Savings report, there's a chart. And on that chart, it highlights exactly what Ed mentioned, which is 6-to-1 overall, but building codes, adopting the latest building codes, 11-to-1. So let the data speak for itself. The best return on investment for hazard mitigation is building codes. Shout that from the rooftops.
Cindy, your thoughts as we close?
Yeah, I agree the data is important, but I would also, I think we talked about this a little bit last week, that code should be a required consideration for all hazards mitigation plans. Simply encouraging inclusion has in general not led to serious consideration of code implementation by many of the states, localities, territories, and tribal stakeholders. I think we had gave an example of a study last summer found that of the approximately 33 states where FEMA determined that hazard resistant codes were not in effect for the majority of jurisdictions, only 10 of those states plans did not discuss or even mention adopting codes that address existing hazards.
So I guess from where you all sit, both Ed and Eric, that's an interesting challenge for FEMA to tackle. We've submitted our comments on that, and hopefully we'll continue the conversation on that piece of it to try and make some progress. Final thoughts from the both of you, maybe on the hazard mitigation piece and how we might use that as a little bit of a carrot to
Right.
move the building codes piece down the field.
Well, I would just offer a couple thoughts. One, the hazard mitigation plan and the planning process is broad. It's inclusive. It's like a vessel into which everything you put, you can take away from. The building codes efforts and the mitigation planning efforts coincide within the same division, my division. So we are increasing our ability to talk and to make sure that one is mindful of the other. How do we make things better? I think it's by taking a whole of community approach. That's an overused phrase, but it's a good one. That wherever we can find common cause, wherever we can work together, we can increase the volume of the conversation. We can increase the opportunity for leverage. The planners leveraging regulators and vice versa.
Very good. Well, at this point, that's we'll have to close on that. That's the time that we have. In fact, I took 2 minutes from the rest of the group, so we'll go ahead and close here. We could probably go on with this for another couple of hours and still not be done with the topic, but I think we conclude in the spirit of an ongoing conversation with all the parties here and all of the Code Council, 65,000 members nationwide and internationally. So with that, on behalf of the Code Council, I'd like to thank all of you for participating in our discussion today. Happy Building Safety Month. As a reminder for the folks in the audience, those of you that submitted questions, we will respond to you, although we will do it offline and we'll respond directly to you. We'll get answers from our panel and drive those to ground for you. And also this session will be posted on the ICC website, iccsafe.org, and it will likely be under the advocacy tab somewhere. So we'll get that information out to all of you by email once it's up, as well as a copy of the presentations, which will be available following the presentation. So thank you all for joining today. I invite our panelists to stick with us for a few minutes. I'll ask our communications team to put us back into practice mode, and we can have a quick wrap-up discussion before you all leave. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a great rest of your day. Stay well.